Good afternoon. My name is Kelsey Olson, and I have the great pleasure of serving as the Deputy Secretary of the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Welcome to the 6th Annual Kansas Summit on Agricultural Growth. Thank you for taking your time today for this discussion on ag equipment manufacturing and sales as we work towards growing together the ag industry in our state. Although this year's Ag Growth Summit event will be held in person next month in August, we have decided to once again host our sector breakouts online and hopes to allow for more participation from individuals like yourself across the state. After all, it is your involvement that is key to the success of this event and key to the growth and success in the Kansas agriculture industry. The strength of Kansas agriculture comes from your hard work, dedication, and leadership. The purpose of the summit is strategic industry growth, and that requires communication, coordination, and collaboration. Thank you again for taking your time out of your day to be a part of this effort to talk about ag equipment. I will now turn the webinar over to Russell Palashka.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Olson. I am Russell Palashka with Kansas Department of Agriculture, Division of Ag Marketing. And I'm very glad to see everybody on here today and glad you've taken time out of your afternoon to join us for this important topic. So we'll be focusing the next hour and a half on the ag equipment manufacturing sector. So Kansas is home to a lot of agricultural companies of all sizes, specializing in equipment for livestock and farming. So many of these companies have an international presence, a very impressive market penetration within the United States as well. The farm machinery and equipment manufacturing sector contributes $4 billion annually to the Kansas economy and is the 37th largest industry in the state of Kansas. So nearly 90% of Kansas land mass is devoted to farming and ranching, providing ample customers for our ag manufacturers across the state and all of their product lines that they carry and manufacture. According to a Kansas Department of Agriculture in-plant economic model, the estimated direct impact of farm machinery and equipment manufacturing, lawn and garden equipment manufacturing, food product manufacturing, and sawmill, woodworking, paper machinery sector, that entire sector is $3.4 billion in output and over 6,700 jobs across the state. This includes indirect and induced effects. If we figure those indirect and induced effects in, that total economic impact reaches $5 billion and over 15,000 jobs across the state of Kansas. So it is a very important sector in the state of Kansas. And again, welcome, and we're glad you're a part of it. Of course, a few housekeeping details. And by that time, we had some discussion before that everybody should be a Zoom expert. However, there is always a few glitches, whether that's a mouse dying on us or not quite the proper lighting, or we just can't get our sound to work. But there are issues that can arise. So if we have those issues, we do have IT on standby to help out as needed. But during the presentation portion, we ask that all participant microphones be muted, and they will be muted until the presenters are done. At that time, if you have questions during the presentation, please drop those into the chat. Dana Ladner with our Ag Marketing Division will be monitoring that chat, and we'll ask those questions after each presenter. So again, if you do have a question, put it in the chat. If not, after with the presenter, you can unmute and ask your question live. Lastly, the session is being recorded, and we'll be posting that online, and that should be available either later this week or early next week. So without further ado, we're going to begin our session. And at this time, I'd like to call upon Mike Bergmeyer, who is our industry representative, who's been a part of the lead on ag equipment manufacturing for several years. So Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Bergmeyer, president of Shield Ag Equipment in Hutchinson, Kansas, and I'm also a sitting member of the Kansas Department of Ag Marketing Advisory Board, and I welcome all of you to this session. As agricultural equipment and service providers, there's really no need to lecture all of us attendees about how much things have changed in the last couple of years. It's obvious that world events have impacted costs and availability for fuel and fertilizer, farmland, equipment and parts, buildings, bins, and other on-farm systems, and then labor, including availability, and raw materials for about everything. And some effects linger with long lead times and extremely high inbound freight and energy costs. Government policy has made it difficult for small manufacturers to compete with total unemployment program benefits. And younger people are simply not entering the hourly workforce at the same pace as they were just 10 years ago. The September 6th automatic expiration of the additional $300 per week in federal unemployment benefits should get more people back into the workforce. So that will help. But in the end, the benefits programs have increased hourly wages in the 10 to 15% range, and wages are generally pretty sticky in a given community as we all compete for the same hourly workforce. None of us have sat back and cried the blues, at least in public, about the last 2 years. And the purpose of this collaboration is to learn a little bit about how we can work together to develop synergistic relationships that bring new products and services to the market using the brain power and skill sets of Kansas companies. Through the Ag Summit and follow-up activities, my company has benefited from 3 new relationships with other Kansas companies that have resulted in new products for agriculture, to include an expanding export market in Eastern Europe. Your input is important as we continue to leverage our core competencies. In the next few minutes, Chris and Clint will be helping us to understand some of the supply chain issues we are facing and give us a bit of a glimpse into the future. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Mike. At this time, I'd like to call upon Tiffany Stovall, CEO of Kansas Manufacturing Solutions, to introduce our keynote speaker. Tiffany?
Thanks, Russell. So Dr. Chris Keel is actually one of my absolute favorite presenters, and so it's my honor to introduce him today. Chris is Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence and one of the co-founders of the company. Armada is a corporate intelligence firm specializing in analyzing the market forces that are bearing down on your company. And they use proprietary methodologies built over the past 20 years to process and understand what's happening in your world today. Chris is Armada's economic analyst and has worked with a wide variety of private clients and professional associations over the past 18 years. He is the economic analyst for the Fabricators and Manufacturers Association and writes their bi-weekly publication, Fabrinomics, which details the impact of economic trends on manufacturers. Besides all that experience and industry expertise, the best thing about Chris is that he makes economics sound easy and palatable for us non-economic folks. So it is my absolute honor to be able to introduce Dr. Chris Keel. Chris, I'll just pass it over to you. Dr. Keel.
Yeah, I'm waiting for them to let me back on. There we go. Okay. I was waiting for IT to bless me. So I'm with you. I want to thank Russell for pointing out the 3 things that can happen to people even when they have had experience with Zoom calls, because I'm the one that had the mouse fail. I'm the one that has lousy lighting because I'm trying to do this from a hotel room, and it just, the list goes on and on. So no matter how many of these we've done, and I've done 150 in the last year, there's always something new and exciting. And I also want to get out of the way right away that I'm well aware that corporate intelligence is an oxymoron. So we're going to kind of ignore that and go from there. So I have a few slides. As you are well aware, economists are not allowed to speak without slides and graphs. It's part of our union agreement, I think. So we're always trying to, now if I can get this thing to get out of the way, move. Technology, it's our friend. Okay. So kind of calling this the good, bad, and ugly. We're seeing a lot of progress this year, particularly compared to last year. But with that progress has come problems, and we sort of anticipated this, but probably not as much as we should have. We looked through 2020 with kind of astonishment the whole year. We didn't really expect this to be this serious an issue. If you remember back to March and April, we were very confidently suggesting that this was all going to be over by May or June. Remember the May rebound, June at the latest, we were going to be back on top. June came and went, July came and went, the whole year came and went, and it never did get much better. At the beginning of this year, we were pretty sure that we were going to see recovery, but we thought it would be slow. We thought it would be methodical. We thought it would be marginal in the first quarter, a little bit faster in the second quarter, and then begin to speed up. We did not expect 9% growth in the second quarter of this year. That has contributed to some of the supply chain issues. And so we'll talk a little bit about how these things all have kind of fed off each other in the last year or so. To get proper perspective, we have to understand what an economist actually is, and no one really agrees. My friends all think I play with money. My mom thinks I'm an accountant. My societal reputation is some sort of a soothsayer that has all the answers. The government thinks I just print money. I think I explain things in great detail, but what we really do is argue with each other, and that seems to be our primary function. So as at the beginning of the year, we had these three options. We thought we would see probably the blue line. We thought we would see some growth, then things would taper off, and we would start to see a little bit of a slump by the end of the year. That is completely off the table. Nobody is looking at that now. We had a few people saying, well, maybe we'll have the black line. It'll just be methodical growth, kind of getting through the year and then seeing some improvement into 2022. Oh no, we're not getting that either. We got the orange line where we came out of this like a rocket. We were out of this recession in April of this year. I mean, realistically, if you go back to 2020, this was a 2-month recession. We began to get recovery out of it relatively quickly, and we were completely back to where we had been by April of this year. All of that has contributed to the pressure on labor, on raw materials, on imports, on exports. So it's somewhat predictable, the situation we're in now, but it doesn't mean that we were really ready for it. We're going through a period that is going to be unparalleled and unprecedented and will not be repeated. By the time we get into 2022, we're going to be back to normal. We're going to be back to the numbers that we've seen for the last 20, 25 years. That 9% growth in the second quarter will become 7.5% growth in the third quarter, maybe 3.5% growth in the fourth. By the time you get to next year, it's going to be in the 2.5 to 3 range, and that's pretty much where it will stay. That's where it's been for the last 20 years. In 2021 and 20, we had a tremendous impact as far as government spending. That orange box is government contribution to GDP growth. It virtually vanishes by 2022 and 2023. All of that money that's been pouring into the economy in the way of stimulating and extending unemployment and all the sort of things that Mike was referring to a minute ago, that basically vanishes, and we go back to the world we've known for the last 10, 20, 30 years, consumer-driven growth. So looking at the supply chain in specifics and looking at what's been going on both globally and nationally, it's been overwhelmed. Part of the problem is that the demand has been far in excess of what the producers were ready for. And there were issues that evolved around the restrictions and the protocols that came along with COVID-19. One example was lumber. We all saw lumber prices go absolutely into orbit. They had never been that high. And then they abruptly began to fall again. All of that was traceable back to the sawmills out west, who went from running 3 shifts to 1 shift maybe, and in some cases shutting down altogether because they didn't have enough people. They didn't have people willing to work, able to work. COVID shut down some of the operations. It took several months before that came back to some semblance of normal. Producers now catching up, the lumber supply is catching up, and the prices begin to decline. But you've seen that in almost all of the commodity groups, whether it's chemicals or grain, any of these things. I mean, rail traffic has been increasing dramatically in the last 2 or 3 months, really. The last quarter or two, you see numbers jumping up by 21%, 36%, 20, I mean, 68% growth just in metallic ores and metals. I mean, that's staggering. That's the factory sector trying to catch up with demand. And it's been a struggle because, again, as Mike pointed out, we've had a labor shortage issue that extends far longer than COVID-19. We are certainly seeing a decline in people coming in for those traditional hourly jobs, but we've had a shortage of skilled labor for decades. The number of job openings in manufacturing has been high for a very long time. It's been accelerating ever since the 2008 recession. Something that you're well aware of, a lot of people are not, manufacturing is fundamentally a small business sector. 75% of the manufacturers in the United States have less than 25 employees. People tend to think of manufacturing in big terms. They think of Boeing, they think of Ford, big assembly operations who really don't manufacture a lot. They take parts manufactured by other companies and put them together into a finished consumer product. The majority of the companies feeding into those large assembly operations are small. And if they can't find one or two or three key people, they're seriously at a disadvantage. They're not in a position to train their own people. There's always been this notion that all you have to do is hire somebody with a willingness to work and you can train them. Well, that's not as easy as one would assume. It's very difficult to train people for these skilled positions. Can't be done quickly. And who's going to do that training? I was talking to a manufacturer not that long ago about that whole subject. And he said, look, here's the problem. Even if I found somebody that's willing to be trained, I'm going to have to go to one of my experienced guys and say, look, on top of everything else I'm asking you to do, all the extra hours, all the extra pressure to meet production goals, I also want you to train this guy. And I said, you wouldn't believe the look I get. And it's not a very friendly one. It's basically, you're kidding me, right? Are you planning to pay me double what you're paying me now to have this additional responsibility put on me? No. Well, I don't know that I want to train this guy. So these are the types of concerns that companies have if they're trying to do some of this stuff on their own. They need help, and that pipeline is critical. It has to come from the secondary schools, it has to come from trade schools, community colleges, any place where people can get this skill development. We've seen retail imports increasing by the month. The number of TEUs coming into the ports has been accelerating at a very rapid rate ever since last year. All of this indicative of trying to catch up on that supply chain decline. Some of it has a direct impact on agricultural machinery, some of it doesn't. But part of what is hanging up the supply chain for the ag equipment sector are all the other things coming into the ports at the same time. I was talking to some people today. They just now had sort of an inventory of the containers that have been delivered to Long Beach. There were at least 500 of them that contained Christmas 2020 stuff bound for consumers last year, showed up this year. The ports are clogged with these kinds of containers, ships that are anchored offshore, all kinds of issues that have seriously impinged the growth of the supply chain to meet the current demand. We do a transportation demand index, we being Armada, and what we're trying to measure here is not necessarily what is happening with transportation, but the demand for it. And the index that we use is real similar to things that you've seen with the Purchasing Managers Index and the like. Anything over 50 is considered growth. Anything under 50 is considered contraction. Obviously, we had tremendous contraction in 2020, but look at where we are now. Those numbers are getting close to what they were prior to the 2008 recession when we had that boom in 2007. And this is across the board. It's rail, it's truck, it's air, it's maritime. There is no sector that has been left behind. They are all moving at a very rapid rate, and they're facing the same kinds of problems all the way across the board. There's not enough truck drivers. There's not enough people to work on the rail. There are not enough pilots. There are shortages in terms of seafarers. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So even as the transportation companies have capacity, technically, have enough tractors, have enough trailers, they don't have enough people to drive them. And that becomes another inhibition as far as the supply chain is concerned. We've begun to see transportation inflation ease off a little bit, and will probably continue to ease off through the course of this year, mostly because the transportation companies are starting to catch up. They are beginning to get a little bit more aggressive about what they ship and how they ship, and becoming a little more scientific about how they're distributing. And they're also catching up as far as some driver recruitment, but it's going to be a while before those numbers really get back to where we have a comfort level with transportation inflation. One of the things that has certainly complicated the transportation sector has been the growth of online retail. The consumers now doing a lot more work online than they used to. That has stimulated the parcel business. We all know that. We've been watching UPS and FedEx and Amazon trucks take over the world. Well, that's another indication of how jammed that transportation supply chain sector has been. Truck driver pressure index continues to accelerate, a little bit of a decline during the 2019-2020 period, and then it's right back where it was before. The average age of an over-the-road truck driver now is over 60. The average age of an engineer in the rails is over 60. You're getting into that circumstance with pilots as well. They tried to give the airlines a little bit of a break by extending the retirement age of pilots from 60 to 65. Now they want to move it to 70 and try to figure out ways to get more pilots into the system. Those of you who are trying to fly now are running into something that you didn't run into a few years ago. Airplane flights being canceled because there's no one to fly them. There's nothing wrong with the plane, they just don't have any pilots. And that is becoming a bigger and bigger issue every day. One of the things that's been driving all this is this growth. I mean, the manufacturing sector, generally speaking, and this is a study that we've produced over the last year, it's called our Strategic Intelligence System. That growth is nearly unprecedented. We never really did get out of the 2008 recession. We did not get back to where we were in 2007. We bumped along for several years, never did get back to where we started. We came out of this last recession like a rocket, and we have continued to expand. This study looks at everything from machinery to fab metals to aerospace, automotive, agriculture, all of the different sectors of manufacturing, and they're all pushing this envelope and all pushing this number to highs that get us back to where we were in 2007 and beyond. The expectation is that by the time you get to the end of 2022, you get a little bit of a hook start, and that hook has gotten a little more pronounced the more we've looked at it, but it's still hooking at a level higher than we were in 2007, much higher than we were in 2019, 2020. There's a lot of capital investment going on. There's a lot of investment in general going on in the manufacturing sector, and the supply chain has been part of what's been driving that. So far, all the things I've said have been negative. The supply chain is stressed and it's expensive. Here's the positive thing that's coming out of the supply chain crisis. Companies that did a great deal of their work overseas are rethinking that decision now. The globalization trend is being interrupted. The just-in-time system isn't working the way it used to, may never work that way again. Companies are now trying to look at their supply chain and say, do I really want a global supply chain? Do I want to have more of my supply chain domestic, more local? You're seeing diversification out of China into other countries, but you're also seeing reshoring and onshoring to the US. The numbers are still small, to be absolutely frank. I mean, we're still losing a certain amount of manufacturing to the rest of the world. We're not getting the rush back that some had expected, but it's coming back at a pretty steady pace. There are two things that are driving reshoring to the US. One is that if your company is doing less labor-intensive work and more machine-intensive work, you're competitive with anybody in the world. The reason companies went overseas was either to have access to raw materials or to have access to cheap labor. If cheap labor is no longer a real necessity with your company, then all of a sudden the reshoring option becomes legitimate. And you're seeing a lot of companies at least pulling part of their production back to the United States or back close to the United States. One development that is going to be very significant in the months to come, and something for this whole area to watch closely, and I won't go into gory details, but Kansas City Southern Railroad is in the process of being bought by Canadian National. The Kansas City Southern has been a coveted target for rail for a long time, but there are concerns about antitrust and the like. So the Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, and Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern all sort of shied away from that acquisition. Canadian National has not. Their goal, their stated goal, is that they want to shift as much as 40% of the freight that's coming into the West Coast ports to the middle of the United States. What they want to do is bring that material to the port in Vancouver and the port in Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico, which Kansas City Southern essentially runs. The freight would then be railed to the middle of the United States, the middle of Canada, the middle of Mexico, and that's where the break bulk and distribution would take place. So think about the implications of millions of containers moving to the middle of the country for distribution, not being distributed from the West Coast. It changes a lot of dynamics. It makes the whole I-35 corridor a transportation and logistics hub, and that's going to happen relatively quickly. So I'm going to quit at this point, so there's some time for interaction and questions. I don't want to take up my colleagues' time excessively, though I'm notorious for sucking all the air out of the room. The way that I look at these meetings is kind of an introduction. You now know me, you've met me. I'm promising you that I'm just as long-winded in an email as I am in public. So if you have a question, you have a follow-up, feel free to get in touch and we can take it from there. Just be aware that the supply chain concerns that we have will fade a little bit by the end of this year, early into next, but they won't go away completely. And as these concerns become more embedded, they start creating opportunities. They create opportunities for manufacturers to become the domestic supplier of companies in the United States that are tired of being dependent on that global chain. And with that, I think I'm going to hush. I think I'm at my magic hour or close, and then we'll take some time at the end, I think.
Going to ask, do we have any questions for Chris? We've got a few minutes here that we could take some live questions.
Oh, come on, Jan always has questions.
Of course I do. Chris, what is it that associations like the Department of Ag, like Kansas Manufacturing Solutions, what is it that we can do to help these manufacturing companies? You know, I think they're just stressed to the hilt. And, you know, are there certain things that you can maybe direct us to do to help them?
Well, it comes down to sort of long and short-term assistance. The long-term assistance is going to range anywhere from helping build that labor supply, because that's not something a company can do on its own. They need that pipeline. They need the schools and they need the universities and the colleges and the trade schools to be aware that these careers are out there. It's very difficult for an owner of a company to go out there and be a recruiter at the same time. Short term, it's going to be things like helping people network these opportunities. You have a lot of companies who are now sort of rethinking their whole supply chain. And they're thinking, wow, I sure wish that I could get whatever I wanted from someplace other than Shenzhen. And there's some company in Kansas goes, we make that. We
Exactly.
can do that. We can make that. We're a lot closer than Shenzhen, you know, and it's like, so they need that opportunity to make those connections. I was at a conference in Vegas last week of woodworkers, the woodworking business. And one of the more interesting booths that I visited was a guy that reacting to the shortage of building materials, and they had learned how to make MDF out of rice straw. and it's a new product, it's a new development, it's only been around for a few years, but this stuff is amazing building material, and it's made out of a complete waste product. And they're right now really only operating in California, but they're saying there's country parts all over the country that produce rice. We would not have to import nearly as much of this material as we currently do if we did more of this. And they're actively looking for contacts. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to connect. And I think the best thing that KMS does and your new group out in Great Bend that I spoke to is that connecting and helping people meet one another and say, hey, I can sell you and I can buy from you, and kind of start taking business back to Kansas.
Great, thank you.
Dana, any other questions that came in?
I just had a quick follow-up, if I might, about rail service.
Mhm.
That Edgerton Rail Yard has been a real boon for Kansas folks because we can bring things in from the port, get them cleared in customs there, and then brought right into Wichita
Right.
area, in the Hutch area, and all kinds of other markets. Will the Canadian buyout of a rail concern change that, or won't they just continue to do the same thing they're doing there in the Edgerton area?
Yeah, their intent is to keep it up. And we've heard, without getting too detailed, Kansas City Southern is actually a client of ours. So we're desperately learning the words to "Oh Canada," so they can continually be our client. But by all intent and purpose, they want to leave Kansas City Southern the way it is. They really just want that connection between Canada and Mexico. Plan to expand all of the things that KCS has been doing, as well as many of the short lines that work currently with them. I mean, there's probably 250 short line railroads that work with KCS, another 300 or 400 that work with Canadian National, because they bought Wisconsin Central a number of years ago. So they already penetrate pretty deeply into the US. Their idea is full speed ahead on all the things that have already been put in place, and just try to accelerate that so that we become even more of a destination than the ports. The idea is that the West Coast ports are jammed. They can't grow anymore. They're landlocked. They're overly congested. Vancouver is only at 65% capacity. Lázaro Cárdenas is like at 40% capacity. So they just want to really push where there's opportunities. That's what they're saying anyway.
Russ, I'd like to thank Jan Peters and Mike Bergmeyer for their comments. Heidi, making you've turned your video on. Would you like to ask a question?
I would. I am with J&J Precision Machining. I am out of Natoma, Kansas, which is in the northwest corner of the state. And we're surrounded by farm equipment, and we've got CNC mills and lathes, and we've got room on our machines, and we would like to get a hold of some of this business. And yeah, we're just looking to make connections and be a part of this reshoring process.
Very definitely, because it's accelerating much faster than people thought it would. Because when people would start to explore that reshoring, at first they think, well, it's going to be expensive, but the more they begin to look at how much it's costing them to do business globally, I mean, it used to be cheap, but the prices have gone up and transportation is expensive. And people are now beginning to realize that, producing in the United States is not more expensive, and it's a lot more convenient, and particularly when you're now being consumer driven. Consumers want these changes and want these things right away. And when you tell them, well, we're getting it from China, if you just give us 6 months and we'll get it to you, particularly in agriculture, it's like, we'll be sure to get that to you in January. Yeah, we don't plant in January. It gets
Right.
cold here. Hello. So there's a lot of opportunity. And like I said, the critical thing, the state does a great job and KMS does a great job, is just bringing people together. And I'm at a manufacturing meeting today, Industrial Heating Equipment Association, and I mean, that's all they're doing is people getting together going, hey, I make this. Well, I need that. Well, good, because I make that. How about if I sell that to you?
Yes.
business.
Yes, it would revitalize the state for sure.
Yep, definitely.
Well, thank you for the question. And like we said, please continue to put those questions in the chat and we'll come back around at the very end and any other discussion that we might have missed on that. So at this time, I'd like to bring on Gina Becker with the Technology Development Institute to introduce our next speaker. Gina?
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Clinton Johns, who is a co-president of Steel and Pipe Supply Company located in Manhattan, Kansas. Clint actually grew up in Manhattan, graduating from Manhattan High School in 1999. He went away to Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, and then, like a good Kansan, returned promptly to start work as an inside salesperson with Steel and Pipe Supply in 2007. Clint Johns worked his way up through the sales and commercial side of the company and was this year in January named co-president. So he has spent his career intensely involved in the steel market, gathering expertise through experience. He also now works with outside consultants to get an even fuller perspective on the steel market and supply issues globally. Clint and his wife and their 1.5-year-old daughter are very much looking forward to this coming February, when they will have a grand welcome for a new member to the family. But meanwhile, let's have a grand welcome for Clinton Johns to speak on steel supply.
Thank you, Gina. Appreciate that introduction. Yeah, my 1.5-year-old daughter also kept us up last night, so if I'm a little groggy-eyed, you'll know why. I also, like Dr. Chris, rely on PowerPoints. So let me see if I can get this shared. So Steel and Pipe Supply started in 1954 here in Manhattan, Kansas. It's since grown to a multi-location business here throughout the Midwest. You can see the locations here on the map in the middle. Got our home office here in Manhattan, which houses our corporate functions of sales, purchasing, administrative functions. And then we also have a location in Kansas City, one over in St. Louis near Jonesburg. We have 2 locations in Tulsa. They're in the Port of Catoosa, a location in Longview, Texas, and also one in Houston, Texas. We really break down our business into 3 parts. We have general line, warehouse, distribution, which is kind of what you see here on this truck. Beams, bars, angles, tubing, ship that out on a daily basis. Then we also have 2 coil processing facilities, one of our locations in Tulsa and then one in Houston. And then we also do provide some first stage fabrication services to our customers to help with, if they need some additional capacity, we can help supply parts instead of raw steel. So really moving into the heart of the presentation and what Gina asked me to speak to today is what's going on with steel. Why has it gone up so much? What's the forward view look like, and what can manufacturers like yourselves do to navigate the volatility that we've experienced here over the last several months? Unfortunately, I think it's going to continue. The volatility has been extreme, and I think it's not going to subside anytime soon. So the record climb to hot roll coil prices. Hot roll coil, in our industry, we use that as the benchmark. Our company, Steel and Pipe, we trade in only carbon steel. So if you have questions about aluminum, stainless, any of the shiny metals, I'm not your guy. If it rusts and it sinks, I can talk to it. We probably stock it, but we use this hot roll coil benchmark it really is a gauge for what steel prices are using. It's the most heavily traded steel commodity outside of maybe rebar, both here domestically and probably globally. So this dates back to 2001. You can see some of the volatility we've experienced over the past 2 decades. You had the 2008 run up right before the financial crisis. You also have some spikes here in 11, 12, you had quite a bit of stability. Things bottomed out. You had Section 232 that was put in place by the prior administration. We saw a quick run up, but I think this graph really highlights we've never seen anything like this before. Prior to 2001, I mean, steel may be traded in a band of a couple $100s a ton. And now you're talking, this slide's even outdated. The hot roll coil index is now above 1800 as we sit here this week. So this little inset here, shows that in less than a year, we've had almost a $1,200 a ton, more than a $1,200 a ton rise now that it's over 1800, which is, the rise itself is more than what the prior high water mark was for hot roll coil. So this I think is a very interesting slide. It's something that a lot of industry participants watch, is what is the price of hot roll coil here in the U.S. Compared to the world export market. And so this yellow line tracks the U.S. price. The red line tracks the world export price. Again, that's kind of a conglomerate of what the price would be in those foreign countries' own domestic markets. And then you look at the spread. You go back less than 12 months ago, we were actually trading at a discount to the world, which you can see historically is very rare. And now that spread has blown out significantly. Another thing that I think is very interesting to highlight, the extreme, that also illustrates the extreme run up in steel, is in relative to other commodities that have also seen massive gains on a trailing 12-month basis. So you look at these four groupings here: hot roll coil, iron ore, busheling, and Turkish scrap. Those all have a futures market, same as wheat, soybeans, grain, or corn. You can go out and trade futures. Year over year, it has seen those four commodities have seen the largest percentage increase. We put some cryptocurrencies on here just for fun. But hot roll coil has almost risen on a percentage basis as much as Bitcoin. So again, just highlights the extreme nature of the environment we've all been living in the last 12 months. So then why is this happening? And I think a lot of the things that Dr. Chris talked about are applicable here to steel specific. So why? Well, there were, as he mentioned, there were drastic supply cuts in response to COVID. Whether it's or steel mills, anybody in the steel supply chain, they were probably looking at worst case scenario. If you go back to March or April of last year, how bad could things get? So a lot of layoffs, a lot of mills, shuttered capacity. Some mills have still yet, some of that capacity has been shuttered forever. It's never going to come back. So very drastic and deep cuts at the mill level, at the production level, and even at the service center level, like ourselves. Many of us across the industry and OEMs cut their steel inventories, trying to conserve cash based upon probably more of a worst case scenario than what panned out. I don't think anybody was predicting the rapid rate of demand recovery. Demand, so what happened? Demand did not drop nearly as much as what everybody had anticipated. So all of a sudden you have a significant supply and demand imbalance. So as we started to climb out of COVID, another thing that in particular for steel that happened about the same time that's kind of been lost is you had really an implosion in the price of oil, which was also, it's a very, oil and energy is a very heavily steel intensive consuming industry. And so that also on top of COVID played into a lot of these mills, service centers, OEMs, whoever it may be, really choking back their supply capacities. So demand did not drop as much as everybody expected. A lot of government stimulus went in place, not just here domestically, but at a global level that also helped us rebound on the demand side. And then here domestically, we still have Section 232 in place. And I can talk more to that here a couple slides further down. But that still provides a lot of a protectionist environment for the steel mills here in the US. Another thing that's really that has transpired over the last, call it 12 to 16 months, and this is probably something that gets underplayed quite a bit when we're talking about, when things may correct themselves, is Cleveland Cliffs, which had traditionally been a ferrous raw material mining company and producer of iron ore and coking coal. They decided to go downstream and acquire many of the U.S. assets for ArcelorMittal. ArcelorMittal is probably the largest steel company globally. They own a lot of steel producing assets across the world. They still own some in Canada and in Mexico, but they divested of a lot of their, which were a lot of old antiquated steel producing assets. ArcelorMittal, being a European-owned company, is really on the has really taken a position that they want to be more green in their production of steel, and so they saw some of these older, antiquated blast furnaces here in the U.S. as assets that they wanted to divest of, and so that's created a lot of consolidation. U.S. Steel also became 100% owner of Big River Steel. It was a new mill. It's probably been in operation 3 to 4 years, and down near Arkansas, close to the Memphis area. They acquired 100% ownership of Big River Steel, and so again, you had all of a sudden, 3 or 4 different steel mill players are now, the number of owners of steel producing assets in the U.S. has shrunk. So that mill consolidation has provided or caused a little more discipline. In fact, the CEO of Cleveland Cliffs, he's a very interesting guy. He has said many times that he values price over quantity. So he's not going to. He's gone on record many times saying, "I'm not going to go fire up antiquated, idled steel producing assets just to produce more steel. I'm looking at the value for my shareholders over just sheer production." And so that is something that needs to be watched going forward, is how does this mill consolidation help keep steel prices, keep maybe a stronger floor under steel prices going forward. I've kind of talked about how they've been slow to restore that capacity. Again, Dr. Chris talked about many of the labor and logistical barriers that even if you can get the steel produced and you can get it produced on time, getting it shipped to your facility when you expect it has been a major challenge. So, we refer to these commodities here. Obviously the finished steel, iron ore, busheling scrap, Turkish scrap. Those are the inputs. They're often referred to as the ferrous complex. And it's really an extreme example of this commodity run-up that we've seen. So this graph highlights, I showed you the year-over-year increase in iron ore futures, but you can see iron ore has really gone off the charts. It's trading at an all-time high as well. A lot of the steel mills in China, which, by the way, one steel producing province in China has more steel producing capacity than the US, Germany, and Brazil combined. which is pretty amazing. So that's just one province, and there's several steel producing provinces in China. So I mentioned ArcelorMittal earlier. You know, they are moving more to, you know, what we call EAF production, which is making steel via scrap. China is having some of these same talks. A lot of their steel mills are the old iron ore blast furnaces. They're not going away, but they are also wanting to clean up their environment over there and switch more to the scrap-based steel production. And so you're seeing, you know, China's demand for scrap, which traditionally China's demand had been mainly in iron ore, that has also pulled up the price of scrap, which, you know, globally, domestically, which is creating higher input costs. And if it stays at these levels, it's going to be really hard to envision an environment where hot roll coil comes crashing back down below, you know, $500 or $600 a ton when you have scrap prices trading at those same levels. So a lot of the new capacity, you know, we are bringing on new capacity here domestically. Some of it's probably been slow. You've got a brand new mill in Sinton, Texas, down near the Corpus Christi area. It's an EAF mill. It's going to consume a lot of scrap. So the demand for scrap on the long-term outlook for that is fairly bullish. And again, it just points to where the floor for steel, that floor may be reset a little higher than what we've been used to. It's going to be hard to envision that $400 a ton hot roll coming back anytime soon. So we spent a lot of time talking about hot roll coil. Again, it's the primary substrate for a lot of, you know, whether it's ag equipment manufacturers, a lot of OEMs that are using sheet and plate in their application. You know, starting in that coil format. Coil is also the primary substrate for any type of tube or pipe that's produced. And so you can see here, I really like this because it shows not only the rise in coil prices, but you also have shows the rise in price in bars, beams, and tubing. So you can see how, you know, tubing has been pulled up significantly by this, you know, heavy run up in coil. You know, in the left hand here, you see you really see the after effects of the 232 bubble coming off. Again, 2018, going back to my earlier slide, was a similar but less volatile, less extreme environment where pricing was running up for most of 2018. So you saw a lot of these products come back down as we ended 2019. 2019 was a declining price environment. In the middle here, you do see that prices started to rebound, but a lot of these gains were really in that last 4 to 5 months of 2020. A lot of 2020 in the light of, you know, COVID, the cratering of the price of oil, the slowdown of the global economy. You know, those steel prices were tumbling really until you got to July or you know, August. And so really the point I'm trying to make here is while this column here on the far right, you know, shows the per ton and the percentage run up in all these products over a 6-month period. You really could go, you know, just 4 months back and add these two numbers together for, you know, over $1,100 a ton rise in coil, $1,200 a ton rise in tube. All these products right now are trading at all-time highs. It doesn't matter the carbon steel product, everything's at an all-time high. And, you know, I said it earlier, this is maybe one of my favorite slides because it just really illustrates how none of the market participants could have predicted or did predict how far up the rise in steel prices would go. So this solid black line graph is the hot roll coil index going back all the way to 2012. And this orange line here is marks the beginning of 2021. This hot roll, or this solid black bar, continues to show what the coil index has done really through the end of May. But this blue dotted line is interesting because this captures what the hot roll coils futures curve was trading at as of January 1st of 2021. And it just goes to show that the market participants, were betting on we'd be down around $940 a ton by the time we got to May. And you could see that we ended May at $1,593, almost $1,600 a ton, for a final settlement in that month of $1,521 per ton. So, if somebody was, savvy enough to go out and buy hot roll coil for the second half, they would have saved themselves almost $600 a ton by making that trade. But it's really easy to say that now. Hindsight's always 2020. We were pushing over $1,000 a ton, which was almost an all-time high at that point. So we had multiple customers that I remember quoting steel at the beginning of the year that were looking to lock up some Q2 tons for their operation. And more times than not, they said, man, steel's almost at an all-time high. I'm going to sit and wait it out. I think things are going to fall off. No one could really argue with them because that's what the futures curve was predicting. But you can see they were taking a big risk by doing that, and that it really did not turn out in their favor. Some of those same customers had to turn back around 2 or 3 months later and pay up 10, 20 cents a pound for that same steel. So the question I most often get is, when will it reverse? There's been a lot of chatter lately around lumber. Dr. Chris, he mentioned it. And the question I get is, well, lumber's coming off, why isn't steel? I think the one thing to point to there, firing up a sawmill is a little bit different than restarting a blast furnace in terms of capital investment. It's also more difficult to shutter that same capacity at the steel mill level than if they get it wrong. If they start it up and all of a sudden demand implodes, it's very costly to turn that back down. Also point back to the mill consolidation. That's why I think we're starting to see some divergence in terms of steel continuing to have strength behind it. It's one of the reasons versus some of these other commodities that have maybe already rolled over. So when will it reverse? Are we at the top? Very common question I get a lot. I'm starting to give a tongue-in-cheek answer, mostly to our internal salespeople of, well, we're one day closer to it. With each passing day, we're one day closer to it. No one doubts that it's going to drop. It's just when. A lot of experts that you can read articles, whether it's Bank of America analysts, any analyst that's studying steel, you hear predictions of Q4 through Q2. Well, that's a pretty wide range. That's 9 months. So trying to guess when that's going to be, I feel like is kind of a fool's errand. You have a lot of different factors, a lot of different variables at play that can speed up or slow down the reversal of these steel prices. One that we watch pretty closely is, are we going to see a surge in imports? How much and how quickly and what impact will the new domestic capacity have as it comes online? I mentioned the mill in Texas. There's other capacity that will come online throughout 2022 across plate products, more hot roll coil capacity. But when and where that comes on, will those mills have difficulty with their startup? Those are variables that really no one can predict. You still have Section 232 in place. I would also point to the strength in the global economy. I mentioned China earlier. It's a big engine that drives the production and the consumption of steel. I talk to our customers pretty often about, when China is consuming a lot of the steel that they produce, it puts pressure on the rest of the globe to ramp up their steel production. While China they are restricted from shipping a lot of their steel products into the United States. It's been restricted a long time before Section 232. They still are a major source of steel for a lot of other countries across the globe. So I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen a surge in imports, yes, we have protection by 232, but if you go back to my earlier graph, the spread there is so wide that I think there's a lot of countries that would just pay the 25% tariff and still ship it in. But you have countries like Korea, Turkey, Vietnam that are having to ramp up their production of steel to supply the needs of their own internal markets because they're not getting that Chinese steel. The Chinese government has actually started to put in place, and they're talking about potentially increasing it, export taxes as steel is shipped or is exported out of China. So it's kind of a trickle down effect when China's shipping steel into the global market, even though they're not shipping it here, the US market the European market become very attractive markets for these other countries like Korea, Vietnam, and Turkey to export their product here because their country's getting flooded with cheap Chinese steel. So that's not happening right now. I don't know when that's going to subside. We've actually been kind of frustrated that we haven't been able to go out and procure a little more import steel to help supplement the shortness that we've been, the short squeeze that we've had from our domestic mills. Some other variables to watch, the infrastructure bill, which it's kind of on again, off again. That's going to be more heavy on plate and rebar, but again, those are products that are produced from scrap. So that will help, prop up the price of scrap if an infrastructure bill gets passed. And then I've mentioned it a couple times, just the global initiatives around CO2 emissions and reductions is something to watch. The old antiquated blast furnace model of melting down iron ore and mixing it with coking coal, it's heavy on pollution. I don't feel like mills here domestically or even across the globe are going to want to make more investments or restart capacity in mills that produce their steel from iron ore. So again, it will reverse. No one knows really when, but many are predicting a new low for hot rolled coil around $900 a ton, which would be, historically near actually the high point. That's $300 a ton below, above the historical average, but $900 a ton below the current prices that it's trading at. And if it can get to 1,800, there's a pretty good chance it could go to 2,000. So this impending price correction, whenever it may come, is going to be the biggest one ever. So I know I'm probably running a little long on time, so that is the final slide. I will save some time for questions if anybody has them.
Well, I appreciate that presentation, Clint. A lot of information there, good information. Any questions from the crowd? Dana, did anything come in on chat?
We have not had anything come up on chat, but like after our first speaker, if anybody wants to turn their camera on, and if you have a question, I can give you acknowledgement then and let you ask your question.
One thing to throw in to kind of reinforce what Clinton was saying is to also be aware that scrap is not produced, it's harvested. And we have seen considerably less harvesting in the last several years because there's less steel in cars. There have been less teardowns in terms of the building industry, and we don't do much scrapping in the maritime sector either because there's a lot of pollution issues. Most of the scrapping of ships is done outside the United States. China is a big scrapping nation for that purpose. We've actually sold decommissioned warships to China to scrap for their sector rather than for ours because of the pollution consideration. So that's another one of those long-term impacts as far as scrap. There's just less of it than there used to be.
Yeah, that's a excellent point. And then on some of the higher grades of scrap are generally produced through auto production. So busheling scrap is the primary substrate for hot roll coil. And right now, with the slowdown in auto production, it's putting a squeeze on the supply of busheling, which is further propping up the price. And you've seen some divergence between what we would call the prime grades and the obsolete grades. The obsolete grades are kind of in the realm of what Chris was talking about. You know, it's demolition, auto shredders, a farmer going out in his field and scrapping out an old implement that produces obsolete grades. But those obsolete grades don't work real well to produce new prime steel that would be used to go into a new F-150. They need that high grade busheling or what they call, direct reduced iron. So it really is a perfect storm of supply demand balance in a lot of ways right now that's affecting these prices.
Clinton,
And then you get manufacturers who are trying to reduce waste, and they're doing more and more accretive manufacturing. I mean, that was the topic of this group here today, is that if they can eliminate as much scrap as possible, it saves them money. And that again ties into that shortage of scrap.
Yes.
Mike Bergmeyer, you had a comment?
just a comment. I felt like there's some counterintuitive things going on. When they canceled the Keystone XL, that put 500,000 tons of steel out there and canceled orders. And then with supplies of vehicles and cutting production of automobiles and trucks and heavy trucks and even some ag equipment due to some long-term or short-term shortages, then the demand for some of that steel is actually down in the short term. So some of it seems a little counterintuitive to me. And I thought maybe, Clinton, you might be able to address that a little bit.
Yeah.
Just tell me I'm smoking or something. I don't know.
I think some of in fact, it's interesting. One of our executives here, he got an email recently from, a hunting buddy of his up in the Dakotas. And I guess there was a lot of line pipe that had already been produced, was sitting out there. And now that was canceled, they were looking for a home for it, trying to find somebody to buy it. So I'm not sure the exact numbers on how much of that line pipe had already been produced.
48,000 tons is what I got. That same memo from somebody looking to sell it in the world market. I have actually wound up getting a copy of it. It was 48,000 tons sitting there on the ground somewhere.
Yeah, so that was crazy. And I don't know how much more was scheduled to be produced for that project, but I think your question about the autos is very interesting. I think you have to roll back to, the rebound out of this, out of the COVID, out of the shutdown. And a lot of these auto manufacturers, they often keep safety stock of inventory in a lot of these automotive grade steels. Sometimes the mills themselves will just keep it in a warehouse. And so what happened when they rebounded and auto production ramped up again faster and there was more demand for vehicles than what anybody would have expected, those inventories got depleted very quickly. And I think what this has allowed them to do, it's kind of created a shock absorber for some of these mills, in that now that these auto producers are in a little bit of a lull due to the chip shortage, really it's allowed them to still continue to run full out. But really what they've been doing is replenishing a lot of these safety stock inventories that were depleted almost overnight when demand kicked back up. So it's a
And
great
the other
blend.
thing to be aware of is that the auto sector continued to produce the cars. And if you look at outside any auto industry manufacturer, they have thousands of cars parked waiting for the chips. I mean, they've built everything but the chip. And so they're ready to deliver them, and recognize that, like all the auto rental companies sold off something close to 80% of their fleets when COVID started, because there was no rental. People weren't traveling. And in order for them to stay alive, they sold off their fleets. All of them are now coming back saying, we need to replenish those cars. I don't know how many people I've heard saying, you can't rent a car in half a dozen major cities right now. When you fly in, there aren't any available. And so there's huge demand. And I think you're right. There's been a lull, but it's not going to last long. And the auto sector will be back up into that demand level. And when it comes to the Keystone, honestly, that sucker has been on life support for 10 years. I mean, everybody wants to kill it. It survives. It gets killed again. It survives. There was not a lot of people putting heavy investment in it. They're saying, this thing becomes public enemy number one about every 2 or 3 years. And at this point, it'd be nice if it happens, but we're not going to count on it. I think your point on the infrastructure is probably very germane, because if we do actually get this, which God knows we've tried for years, there's a lot of repair work that needs to be done, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on an already pressured supply chain.
This has been some really great conversation. And so to be able to stay on time, Russ, I'm going to throw it back to you for the next part.
Appreciate it. And want to say once again, thank you both, Chris and Clint, and also a special thanks to Kansas Manufacturing Solutions for sponsoring Dr. Keel and for him zooming in remotely from his hotel room there. With that, we do have a poll to bring up. So each year we talk about outcomes and action items. And so our first poll question, as it pops up, will deal with the outcomes that have been identified over the past 4, 5, 6 years. And each year we kind of tweak them and go with the next highest priority. But as you look at that list there, we'd like you to select one of the 3 outcomes listed below as the most important to you at this time. I guess there's 4 outcomes. I apologize there. So select one of those that you feel is the most important to you or your business, your operation at this time. We've got about 28, 29 people still on the call, and Robin or Sean, if you could let me know when we've got a little over 25 of them submitted. Like we have about 21, so give you just a few seconds more to think about those. I do have a couple other questions that kind of deal with a topic we've been discussing as a group with TDI and KMS, and looking at how do we provide this type of educational format in your specific areas, and whether or not that would be an interest to Kansas ag manufacturers. So, all right, we're holding steady on those numbers, so we'll bring the results up for that poll. And it looks like a pretty good majority, 48%. Increase in agriculture equipment manufacturing and sales companies in the state of Kansas. So, the second place when their emphasis on technology related ag education at the high school level. So that speaks to that workforce at pipeline of supplying that local pipeline. So working with our schools, whether that's in our high schools or post-secondary, career and tech ed colleges and community colleges. And then that last 19% on expanded trade programs. So any discussion on these, is there anything anybody would like to say or comment about that increase in the number of companies in the state of Kansas? Or is there a topic out there that we don't have listed on there that you're thinking, come on, guys, this really is the number one issue for me personally in my business? If there's something we don't have on there that we need to be looking at as an industry. Don't be afraid to speak up. Well, we're going to keep moving then. A couple of things. Appreciate you taking that poll, and we'll bring up that next question. And it's kind of a two-parter. So if we were to look at doing a virtual informational session specific to ag equipment manufacturers, how often would you like to see that occur? Monthly? And I know we're all busy and it's hard to take that time. Every other month, or maybe once a quarter, if we were to offer some sort of a combined educational thing specific to a topic that was important to the ag equipment manufacturers across the state. And then that last question, number two there, would you attend an in-person networking? I know Heidi mentioned that networking, how do we don't know what we don't know. So who else is out there producing a similar product or a companion product that we can work with? So would you be interested in doing some sort of a networking informational session that would be offered within the region? And we're thinking about regions, we're thinking like Western Kansas or Southwest, Northwest, and breaking up into maybe 5-6 regions across the state. So yes, no, it depends on the topic. So go ahead and fill that in. And I appreciate the comment, Heidi. And we will be getting in touch. Heidi put in the chat there to everyone. She voted for manufacturing, but ag education near and dear to her heart. So we can get a hold of her at Precision Machining there. So appreciate that. So let's go ahead and pop up the results of this poll. And so everybody overwhelmingly for the quarterly, that's good. And yes to 60% said yes to an in-person event. I think we're all ready to get back to in-person events. Wonderful. So that'll be something that this group, KMS and TDI and ourselves here at KDA, and we welcome any manufacturer that wants to be involved in helping plan some of these. We would more than welcome that participation as well, because we're all in this together and we want to increase and grow the ag equipment manufacturing sector. So a couple of things before we leave. First of all, thank you all very much for taking part of this today and this afternoon. As a reminder, this was recorded and it will be available on our website later this week or maybe next week, and that's at agriculture.ks.gov/summit. And we hope that you're planning on attending in person in Manhattan on August 26th will be our in-person growth summit. We'll have a social the night before on the 25th, so make sure you're register for that. And you can register for both of those things at our website at the same agriculture.ks.gov/summit. And before we go, I also want to highlight that this is the second year of the Kansas Department of Agriculture Kansas Ag Heroes. And we encourage you to submit nominations at our website, on the Summit website that I've given you now twice, that you can nominate somebody in Kansas agriculture you feel has provided a notable contribution to the industry or to their community as a whole over this past year. So that nomination period is currently open and will close on August 13th. So please make sure, and if you think of somebody, go to that website. There is on your screen at /agheroes. With that, again, thank you very much for taking time out of your day and we hope to see you in Manhattan on August 26th. Guys, have a great afternoon.